Blog Talk Radio.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio. QLPOR, as it's widely known, features a bevy of poets, spoken word artists, and live poetry readings with best-selling authors. Your host is Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Good evening, everyone. My special guest tonight is Kashiana Singh. The title of her amazing new book is Woman by the Door. Welcome, Kashiana, to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am
honored. You're more than welcome. Great. I'm glad you're with me. We're going to go on a poetic journey for the next hour or so. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you're going to share your work. And we're just going to talk and allow poetry to resonate through both of our bodies, all right?
Absolutely. I'm all in.
All right. My first question that I ask everybody, what is poetry?
Wow. Of course, you had to come up with that question, right? Which is
yes.
funny. We don't think about as often as we should think about. And I'm going to take the liberty of giving you a two-pronged answer, if I'm permitted. The first is,
yes.
What's my definition of poetry? Kashiana's definition of poetry. And the answer to that is, it's the song of life. It's my grandmother humming a prayer as she went about her domestic day. It's my grandfather chanting as he tied his turban. I come from a community where the men mostly wear turbans. And my grandfather chanting the prayer, both in the ritual of tying the turban, as well as the words themselves that he chanted were poetry for me. And then my father conversing with whatever we may call the supreme cosmic force in a one-on-one manner, like he was speaking to a partner on a joint mission. And he would address that force one-on-one loud with everybody around him in the family without fail every time that he stepped out of home to fulfill his role as a police officer. So personally, to me, that is poetry. It's the sounds, it's the oral traditions, and the rituals that seep into your bodies and create an intergenerational, a cross-cultural kinship. And that results in what we want all poetry to do, which is resonance, right? Which doesn't occur only through the evocative use of language, but it's the silences between the words that's used in poetry. And the examples that I gave you, I mentioned my grandfather tying his turban and my grandmother going about her domestic duties and my father having a one-on-one conversation. The words became a part of my body, but their silences, their expressions, the tone on how they said what they said also became a part of my poetic identity as I started to move towards poetry.
Wow.
So that's
very
my
nice. That's a beautiful definition. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's come to for a second on the academic definition, right? And we all know it's from the Greek term poesis or poesy or however you pronounce that. But the thing that stood with me was something one of my mentors shared, which is the difference between praxis and poesis. And praxis is when actions are performed because of an intrinsic motivation, meaning doing the action for itself. Whereas poesy is actions that are performed because of a motivation outside of what you're doing. And that juxtaposition, because poetry is also all about juxtaposition, helps me understand intrinsically why poetry is different from just writing something else or documenting something else. Because the motivation for poetry is something outside of your own self.
Wow. That's a wonderful definition as well. You're on it tonight, Kashiana. Wow. So we know what it is from a personal and a professional perspective. Why is it important, my friend? Why is it important?
Oh, well, couldn't be more important than today. I say that, Michael, but I then pause and say, many generations probably have said the very same thing, right? And we say that it is said that every 30 years, right, history or the circumstances of the earth or the universe or the cosmos repeat themselves. So therefore, keeping that in mind, to me, the most important reason why poetry is important is because poetry serves as being witness. It serves, right, as being both a refuge and a spotlight on that which is most relevant. Maybe most painful, but most relevant.
Yes.
And through that lens, it draws documentation together. It states the problem. It opens space. Remember what I said about the silence and the emptiness is as important as the words. So it opens the space for dialogue. And through that, it becomes a beacon of hope and possibilities. And the last thing I'll say is the reason poetry as witness becomes important is because it asks questions, right?
Wow.
It's never about the answers, but poetry either directly asks questions or creates an engagement through which questions start to get asked. To me, that's why poetry is important.
Kashiana, I'm already in awe of you. Please share a poem.
All right. I will share a poem, and I will share many poems, but I'm going to start in light of what we've just defined and the brilliant questions about what is poetry and why is it important. I'm going to start with a poem called Country. And this poem is from my book that you just mentioned, which is called Woman by the Door. It's come out with Apprentice House Press and available anywhere that you buy your books. And here's how it goes. Country. The one caveat I would say for anybody who's listening, and for you as well, Michael, is that to me, again, country is not necessarily where I'm sitting. I'm calling in today from Boston. I live in North Carolina. But country to me is any place that I have inhabited, either in spirit or in person. And specifically, therefore, this poem becomes a poem about my country of my birth, which is India, and the country of my home, which is the United States.
All right.
Country. When did you stop listening to your own, become unwilling to look up into our eyes, look away from your own opiate limbs, look away from birthmarks on your skin, look away from the falling blisters of your eyes? When did you become so lazy that you let the claws of your feet burrow deep, trapped in your own blemished ground, unmoving even when being eaten alive? Unmoving even when being eaten alive by the blooming anguish of your people, by odors from floating carcasses of your soul, by the waves that beat against the sunken scales of your ghosts, by sordid drippings of fleas fleeing your own mouth. At this very moment, I am a lighthouse standing in watch. I am carving my solitary light into ripples, each ripple a caterpillar pupating, a butterfly pulsating to panchakritya of tandav dance, its wings flapping to the spitting fire of a trillion monarchs, unwilling to die a pause until you listen to the whistling of their alliterative song. They will circle you into an orchestrated garland, evacuating your cauldron of prayers and pledges until you hear their buzzing silence. They will drink incessantly of your matted milkweed. They will churn intemperate until you hear anew. For if you don't, an apocalypse is coming closer and closer and closer towards your shore. You have time now to gaze outwards and listen, to act before being engulfed into the whirlpool of growling stillness, to become the country we knew, to become the country we knew. Thank you.
Wow.
That was country.
Wow. Oh, wow, Kashiana. There is such power in that piece. What is the purpose of that poem? What's the purpose of that poem, Kashiana? Tell me.
It goes to what I said about poetry playing the role of witness, and I think it is. We'll talk a little more. I mean, I think the very act of writing is political. You don't have to write a political poem to be political. The fact that you're picking up your pen and writing down something and putting down language is political. To me, this poem and the purpose is that it's speaking directly to the country without the middlemen involved. And I think all of us have a right to speak to the land, to the country, directly, right? Just like my father spoke to the universe directly, one-on-one, and say, this is my problem, my dear friend, and this is what I need you to do to address it. That's the purpose of this poem.
Wow. Now, that poem is in your new collection. Am I correct?
That is right. It is in Woman by the Door.
Woman by the Door. That's what we're going to talk about now. Let's shift there. What inspired the book?
What inspired the book? Logistically, this book, Woman by the Door, is a conglomeration of poems that came together in approximately the last 10 years, which is when I made my transition from India to the U.S.
All right.
So that's just a logistical concept. The poems, though, while they may have come together in those 10 years, are not about the 10 years, right? They span lifetimes. They span lifetimes before, meaning my childhood. They span memory, meaning memory of others that I was influenced by. And they also move into the current state, which is this poem. The book came together at a time, again, referring to the poem Country, when both the countries that I care the most about were going through a very turbulent phase over the last 10 years, and I don't need to be specific about what. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. So all of that moved into the poems, into the book in some shape, manner, and form. But really what the book is about, which is what the title says, it's about transition, right? There are three spaces in the book. There is the woman, there is the door, and there is the threshold. And all of the poems in the book move in and out of these three places in some shape, manner, and form. And so to your point, as a woman, I was going through a transition. Like I said, my country was going through a transition. I moved with my daughter, who was 16 years old, so I was going through a transition in my relationship. I lived a long-distance marriage. I was going through a transition in that. And I was also going through a transition in my bodily experience because I was entering menopause and shifting in my bodily state to a different place as well. So in a sense, the book is about transition of any kind. And I'll just go a step ahead and say, in my opinion and my experience, all poetry is really about displacement or transition in some shape, manner, or form.
Well, before we move on, tell me more about this displacement. That's a different kind of thinking. I've never heard anyone make that statement before. Tell me about the displacement piece.
Well, so poetry, and we can go back to the greatest poets, right? We can pick up people like the current, let me just pick up Ada Limon because of her being the latest poet laureate of the country, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about her, or let's talk about Layli Long Soldier, or let's talk about Joy Harjo, or let's talk about a lot of South Asian poets that are extremely famous for what they've done. All of the poetry that I am inspired by is driven by some sense of displacement, and the displacement could be physical, right? In my case, for example, I moved countries, so there was a geographical shift. It could be emotional, meaning you're going through displacement in your relationship, and the relationship does not always have to be a romantic relationship. It could be relationships of any kind, right? Parents and children and siblings and community and the place you've grown up in and belong to and the rituals, right? All of that is emotional. And then the last is actually displacement of language, right? Ocean Vuong says, if you read him, Michael, he says that a lot of poets of color, and him being a Vietnamese poet, have to start from a different place because of the displacement that they've had, both in terms of their generational displacement, but also the fact that they're adopting, right, new language and new canons of literature as well. So those are all the displacements that come into being. I'm still a learner. I'm nowhere a poet. I'm trying to learn poetry. And I can say in my case, the displacement or the distance from my home country and the people that I had spent half my life with allowed me to write and rewrite my poetry, whether it was about home, grief, or childhood, with a better sense of clarity and equilibrium. That's what displacement did to me.
Well, have you had an opportunity to write about your theory, the displacement theory? I like that. Have you written about it?
I will take your hint and go there. But no, I haven't yet.
Honestly, I think you should, and you should submit it to the Journal of Poetry Therapy. To be quite honest, I'll share some other journals with you. That would be perfect. All right. Okay. Let's focus again. That was beautiful. So back to the book. If you had to convince a friend or colleague to purchase your book, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that the book is buy it. For sure, thank you, because you should support poetry, number one.
Yes.
but number two, right, we shouldn't justify buying poetry as poets. But I think number two is it's a journey. This book will take you through a journey, which, like I said, the journey of a woman as she stands, right, at a different shore, and the shore both metaphorical and actual, and that's one angle of it. The other angle of it is that it pays tribute. I am not apologetic about the cultural matrix I belong to, so the poem is replete with senses, with tastes. There are poems emerging out of the kitchen, right, and every time my biggest, most favorite kitchen poem is Joy Harjo's poem, right, with the kitchen table. But there are poems about activities of mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, and it doesn't matter that those are Kashiana's references, because every single person reading them will find either a character or a situation to make a connect with and relate to in this book.
All right. Please share a poem.
All right. Since I spoke about the kitchen, this was not what I was going to read and the sequence, but I'm going to go there because I think it makes sense. And the poem is called In My Nani's House, Curds and Whey Were a Religion. And as context, this is again from Woman by the Door. And Nani, in my context, is maternal grandmother. And I'm going to jump in and read it now, Michael. In my Nani's house, curds and whey were a religion. Rendered warm, the milk in homage to perfect temperature, every drop just enough, dripping a muted prayer on Nani's wrist. Stately, it would reside on the dining table in a glazed terracotta pot, its tenderness an immaculate gospel. Spoonful smooth like rays of moon, an attentive healing of my acidic chest, kindness revealed after rested nights. Persisting in pause and patience in my Nani's house, sallow in its maturing, whisked tidally into incubation, the ritual of curd making harnessed my attention for precision and process, for transformation. An unveiling of the delectable aphrodisiac on albaster mornings, always a ceremony. I have failed to assemble curd like that. I have failed to assemble curd like that. Mine settles in watery mouthfuls of regret. It tastes hollow, like an afterthought, forgetting to tighten its surface muscles. It collects into itself, refusing to be real curd, metamorphized. I have tried to do so much what Nani did, but the curd I make always looks like half-fulfilled wishes, as if it is telling me to have more patience, wants me to breathe in, breathe out, and stir the silence. The chewy curd I assemble is reluctant, uncondensed, unlike the metabolic grace in my Nani's house. Sometimes I wish I had stood beside her more often, watched her more closely, her eyes an emblem of Agni, Akash an expanse in her arms. I wish I knew that she was Prithvi, holding hostage an intoxication. I wish I had gathered stillness. I wish I had surrendered my questions to making of curd. There she is, looking at me sideways. Sari pallu sweeping to her waist, a shining plate, pomegranate lips.
Wow.
That's the end of that poem.
Oh, wow.
And I use, as you will see, Michael, if I can share, as I have referred, the culture. So first of all, curd making is very much an Eastern kitchen tradition. We in the Eastern countries set our own curds, right? We don't go purchase the curds from a Walmart or a Target, like we buy packs of yogurt here. So we set our own curd, and that's a ritual in every family, and that's the process this is speaking about. But I do use language and terminology from Hindi or Urdu, which is the two languages that I grew up with. And I'll go to the extent, since you spoke about Woman by the Door.
Yes.
Me and my publisher, Apprentice House Press, made a conscious decision to actually not have any references explaining those words, because it's expected that if you enjoy poetry and you listen and read poetry, it should reach to you in some way, right? And then if it doesn't, and you'd like to dip in further and find your own meaning, there are ways to find meanings of these words, right? So just to explain. That being said, I use words like Agni. Her eyes an emblem of Agni. Agni means fire. Akash an expanse in her arms. Akash means the sky. So the sky an expanse in her arms. I wish I knew then that she was Prithvi. Prithvi is earth. So I'm referring to the three elements, fire, earth, and air or sky in this, through these words.
Oh, incredible. You know, I was reading along with you, and
Thank you.
The page here. I wanted to know whether you plan to I wanted to know whether you plan to record an audio version.
Oh, it's been on my mind. I just haven't got to it, and also because I'll have to do some research, right? I'm sure I'll have to kind of find a way to do it myself. So it's just laziness plus I'll have to invest the time to do it. But I do want to do it.
Well, I think you should, because the question I want to ask is, your voice is so powerful. Your last name is Singh. You sing also when you share.
Oh, thank you.
To me. So what I want to know is, what is the relationship between your speaking voice and your written voice? Both are so powerful.
Thank you so much for saying that. That means a lot to me. And I'm going to answer, I think this is another question that you'll have, which is how did I come into poetry? So I'm going to answer both the questions together because they are interconnected.
All right. All right.
So in terms of relationship between the speaking and the written voice, I think of them as twins. One is an extension of the other. Sometimes these twins have a symbiotic relationship, Michael, right? So one is almost in the manner that the symbiotic relationship works, is feeding off the other, and it's never one always. Sometimes the written voice is feeding off the speaking voice, and sometimes the speaking voice is feeding off the written voice. I will say that how a poem sounds is an important litmus test for when I consider a poem done. I do read out loud as I am writing in terms of my process. That being said, I have had occasions where I myself am surprised on what comes out in my verbal reading in a bodily way, in almost like a bodily experience. And there have been situations, like the first time I read this Nani poem, I had tears in my eyes and in my body. And so there are occasions when I'm reading a poem that I've read like academically for the purpose of the book, right, for putting the book together. But when I read it in a reading like this audience with somebody else, there's a bodily experience that happens. And I don't know how to answer that, but that does happen. I will come back to, therefore, where poetry began for me, or where encouragement happened in terms of poetry. And Casablanca and The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck is a poem that I learned, and my father taught us to read out loud on stage. And my earliest memory of spoken poetry is that poem. And the fact that he would, like, after dinner, stand and have us, right, go through the inflections and the voice and the gestures and how you would be reading that poem. So just wanted to make that connection, that's a poem that's very dear to me for all the reasons that I mentioned, but also like that was my first spoken poem.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like you to please share one more poem before we take a quick break. I enjoy listening to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a poem that shifts the focus a little bit. This poem is again from Woman by the Door, and the book also processes grief. And I mentioned distance, and being geographically distant 7,000 miles away from the situation of that grief or loss, or in this case, death of a loved one, and distance from the people with whom I experienced that loss, allowed me to write about it, and maybe in a way served as a source of catharsis for it. So this poem is called Just a Process After All. And the epigram says, in our village, Funerals is the name of the poem by James Laughlin, and it says, in our village are short and to the point. And here's how the poem goes: just a process after all. The hustle of the 5 days after you, they prescribe 10 to 30 days of mourning, the completion of mandatory actions like curdled milk, ghee, oil lamps, candles, pristine sheets, tilted tears, jasmine-filled condolences, food, and guests. Your hands placed in the position of prayer as the floor was sprinkled with water, purification, release, rebirth. Meanwhile, a forgotten notebook still open at your desk, your baritone voice barely gathered inside the cold walls of an urn cannot bring ashes home. Cannot bring ashes home or keep the urn in your room. Ashes don't germinate life. Ramification, release, rebirth. I feel you. I feel you almost grinning at the edge of the polished rim before the brass vessel bobbles away into the setting sun. The incense burns, sandalwood. Did you promise to reach me as soon as you arrive there? We gather at the dinner table, extended family and all, purgation, release, rebirth. Today, we serve Rajma Chawal. Tomorrow is chicken curry day, exactly like you relish it. Marinated overnight, well-washed, clean. I wish you could hear them asking me if I would write something about the process of putting away life. I wish you could hear them asking me if I would write something about the process of putting away life. I wish you would come back, turn around for a day so I could grab one soaked drop of your voice and nest its vibration within my ribcage, salvation. Thank you.
Oh, wow. We'll be right back.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm here with the wonderful Kashiana Singh. Kashiana, a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Do you think you were meant to be a poet?
Oh, wow. That's hard. You're asking all hard questions. Well, I don't know whether I was...
You know my show. You know, that's why they pay me the big bucks, Kashiana, to ask the tough questions.
They do. Well, and there are no wrong answers, right? So, well, I don't know whether I was meant to be a poet, but I know that I have to write to exist. And to exist, to be better at whatever else I do, right? Whether it's what I do, to your point, to get some bucks in, because a poet doesn't get the bucks in. Whatever I do to engage with community, with family, with my grandchild. I'm a proud mother of a 1-year-old grandson.
Nice. Very nice.
And so to me, if that answers by corollary, that means I was meant to be a poet, and so be it. But I know that I have to write to be able to exist.
All right. So what surprises you most about being a poet? What have you learned about yourself as you think about poetry?
Yeah.
Who are you?
Yep.
And I know this is what I want to know. Do you live your life like it's a poem? That's what I want to know. That's the question.
I will say yes.
Okay.
And I go by my life's mantra, and you will agree as to why I'm saying yes. My life's mantra is work as worship. And that's, by the way, my TEDx talk as well. If you haven't heard it, I would request you to do so. And when I say that work is worship, I would therefore then say I do live my life like it's a prayer. And therefore, again, by that context, a prayer is a poem. And so then, therefore, I'm living my life like a poem.
Wow. Something told me to ask you that in that way. In that way.
Yeah.
Something
and you said what you're finding out about yourself, right? I mean, I think
yes.
We said earlier that poetry is about the questions, and so therefore, when I'm writing, I'm also always asking the questions, right, about am I really living my life as I claim to be, which is like worship? Am I, right, am I sweating the small stuff, or am I focused on the big rock? And that goes to the extent of, and I'll say this, which might be surprising, but I have let poetry inform me at my corporate workplace, and and one would never relate the two together, right? Maybe I'm a corporate slave in my other life, but I relish the other life as much, because I live it like it's worship every day, and B, because I let my poetry inform how I bring myself to the table every day in the boardroom as much as how I bring myself to the page.
Wow, it's beautiful. Well, let me ask this before you share another poem. Has a poem that you've written ever humbled or frightened you? One of your own?
Yes. Yes.
Tell me more.
And that's the poem I'm going to read next.
Okay.
It's
well,
funny,
we didn't
right?
speak tonight. No, we didn't. All right, I'm ready.
So maybe we reserve the why for after reading the poem, because I think the poem should answer the question.
All right, then.
All right. I mentioned at the beginning about tying of the turban, and this poem is called Turban, or pagri, and pagri is the word for turban. All my writing was born into the folds of my father's pagri, one in each fold of his khaki, cotton, starched, smooth, sturdy. I attempted to shape stanzas with my tongue while my hands pulled, stretched, unbound all the 6 yards of cloth, unfurling beginnings. I proudly held at one end on mornings when I was called upon to help twist the length of the landscape. That landscape, that moment, had a spirituality, a gravitas. It snatched at my throat, settling into creased circles. My voice had so much to say. Instead, in quiet observation, I gave it all my care, all my curiosity. His prayer had a very specific tempo. I never dared disturb it. I saw an intimate conversation sprouting into the empty spaces of teacher and disciple, unsaid. A sacred hum became audible. I heard stories being revealed as elders sang hymns in waves. Gentle metaphors were formed in faith as a circular wrapping folded and unfolded words. They became mine, unborn into me as I held the fabric taut. Was taught letters as I held the fabric taut. Was taught letters, my fingers at the edge of a long puggree he so reticently pulled at the other. Tugging just so, he said to me each time we symmetrically styled a turban in performance together. You, my daughter, my Paul. Puggree, turban. Thank you.
Wow. You just want to sit for a moment and allow that to soak in.
Yes. I always need a second after I read or speak that out aloud.
Yes, yes, I understand.
Puggree is a turban worn. I said I belong to a community. In this particular poem, right, it's referring to the turban worn by Sikh men. What is not said and what probably is good context is that ritual, which you probably understood, of tying and wearing. The puggree is a moment of great pride. So I say in the poem, on mornings that I was called upon to tie the puggree, not everybody in the household is called upon to help the man of the house tie the puggree or the turban. So the fact that my father was calling upon me, his older daughter, in a way meant he's giving me the position of his oldest child, right? Somebody who's going to carry forward his legacy. And so there's a physical act of tying, there is the emotional act of the bonding, and there's the unspoken spaces about what others did with that moment, right? And like I said earlier, the prayer that he would be humming as we were going about that act. Again, something that fed into me being who I am today. And I'll close by answering your question, Michael, on why this poem scares me, if it isn't obvious. It scares me, number one, that this poem came to me. Not many of my poems, can I say, came to me. Like this just came. It asked to be written, and it got written in one go. I always make edits, like we all do, but the essence of the poem has stayed since the day I was forced to write it. So that's the reason it scares me, because that means something like that can happen and happen again. So it was almost like an out-of-body experience. And the reason, of course, I'm also proud of it and it impacts me so much is because it is not just about me. It's about every girl who's been in my position, whether it's in the act of tying a turban or some other ritual with the father or the father figure. And I think it connects to all of us as women, as young women, right, growing up.
Wow. You know, that brings up a question, and this is, I ask this every week. So much is happening in the world, Kashiana. The good, the bad, the ugly, and the indifferent. What is the role of a poet in modern day society?
It's a great question. I've thought of that surprisingly, most of your other questions is you kind of put people on the spot, right, with your brilliant questions.
Yes, but that's my goal. I want to trip people up.
you motivate me. Right? Shake us all. But yes, so this is a question again. I think we've been forced to ask this question about whatever we are doing in the world, right? Whether poet or otherwise, in the last few years with everything that's happening around us. And I have crystallized my own answer to myself as 3 E's, E as in the alphabet E. So the role of a poet, according to my own thinking, is number one, that of engagement. And by that I mean engaging with facts and data and creating a space for witness. That of empowerment as the second E, and the empowerment of hope, empowerment of community, empowerment of celebrating kindness, empowerment of celebrating relationships. And the last is that of the role of being an echo, ECHO, which is by how do you be an echo as a poet is by staying authentic to the lived experience. And that's the only way, right, your poem on the page or spoken will connect to anybody beyond your own self. And second, echo, because echo happens in silent and empty spaces. So going back to what I said initially is creating the silence through the poem, just like we said after reading Turbans, let's take a minute. That would initiate some kind of a shift or a transformation, whether it's in an individual or in a broader sense. That's not for the poet to control, but the poet can try and create that moment of silence or those moments of silence through the page and through the spoken word.
Have you written about this? Have you written about this in scholarly journals?
No,
Have you?
Sir. but I'm going to follow up with you afterwards.
Yes. You have a gold mine of information that people need to hear about. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
We will do it together.
Yes, we'll do it together. We'll do it together. And I'll share this. I was tenured and promoted at Oregon State University to an associate professor on the use of poetry in the classroom. I was a professor of counsel education and supervision, but it was through the scholarly use of poetry and writing articles about poetry that helped me along. So, yes, we can work together. We can work together.
Absolutely. I will take you up on that.
All right. Okay. Let's focus. All great writers have great writing influences. Who are some of yours, and what makes them special and great in your eyes?
Yeah, a lot of influences. I would say I'm influenced by almost every word that I read, right? Because, again, a poet needs to be a good observer. But a few that I will call out, actually, I'll call out one thing first, and then I'll get to actually some of the poets and their poems. I recently, when I say recent, it's probably the last maybe like 4 years, got engaged with haiku, which is the Japanese form of poetry. And that has made a huge, I'm nowhere a haiku perfectionist, because the perfectionist of haiku will kill my haiku and say it's nowhere. But I'm very, very inspired by the haiku tradition for a couple of reasons. One, the concept of ma, M-A-A, in Japanese is inherent to the way they live, which is empty spaces and silences. And I've been speaking all the time about silences and empty spaces. So inherent to haiku is that those 3 lines of a few syllables need to have enough emptiness, enough space.
All right.
And that's almost like a discipline that I'm trying to teach myself through that training. Number 2 is the act of reduction, right? So how do you keep peeling the layers of the onion to get to the kernel of what you want to say? And number 3 is haiku and Japanese poetry does not encourage or believe in any broad strokes, right? There's no broad strokes. Everything is about be specific, right? It's about the lily that bloomed at X time on X morning when the sun was shining at Y angle. Everything is about the specifics, almost like looking at the world through an eye of an eagle. And again, I am training myself to learn to do that.
Yes.
I'll jump to the other influences, but I want to add again and repeat and say that has changing not just poetry, which again maybe connects to the question about do you live your life like, but also how I live my life and how I look at people around me and conversations around me differently. So that's one influence and a big one in the last few years, Michael. Specifically, I mentioned I if I have to choose one poem that I'm buried in the grave with, it will be Joy Harjo's Kitchen Table poem.
Oh, wow.
Again, for the simple reason that it's about so much that is real, so much that's about daily life, yet it's probably one of the most universal poems I've read. And that hits me differently each time. A couple of others, and Leila Chatty, if you haven't read her latest book is Deluge. I think it's with Copper Canyon, if I'm not mistaken, but she talks about what I've learned from her is writing from the body. She talks about an illness, and all of the book is around that, but it's extremely beautiful and absolutely brilliant writing to learn from.
Wow.
I will be amiss. The book in my hand right now is The Hurting Kind by Ada Limon. And I love her. Of course, I'm super delighted. You can see me hopping up and down in my chair that she is at the position she is today, but I've loved her always, again, for how she becomes so specific, right, about that bird on the bird feeder. She talks about what that is and what color and what it's called and what it teaches her. And again, she comes from a place of daily living, but makes it extremely universal. So I'll summarize by saying, and many, many others, I'll take up your whole show if I keep going about it. I will mention one more book of a contemporary writer for the sake of the audience that's listening. Joan Kwon Glass is an American Korean poet who's just published a book called Night Swim. And that is, if you heard me read a poem about grief and loss, and her poem is entirely on loss and suicide, and it's absolutely beautiful, that book. So a lot of poems, a lot of poets, but these few will stand out if I'm supposed to say these right at the end of my life, and I have only 2 minutes to give the answer.
Right. I want to know, does writing energize or exhaust you? I can't tell. Does it energize or exhaust you?
It does not exhaust me. It energizes.
Okay.
There's no question. I have written every day for the last 5 years, whether it's a few words or a full poem, doesn't matter. And I've written at the end of 80-hour work weeks, 100-hour work weeks, and I've come to poetry to get my energy, to ground me. So poetry is an anchor. It energizes me at all times.
Wow. Your book is 116, I think, pages. And how long did it take you to write this book?
It's over 9 years.
Over 9 years. Wow. It's 111 pages. Information about the author at the end. What I want to know is, one of the major parts of writing is the editing process. And some poets claim that a poem is like a living creature. Once it's out there, there's nothing you can do to correct or improve it, while others edit meticulously, not leaving much from the original draft form. What is your take on editing?
I absolutely believe in editing. You just heard me talk about the reduction process that I'm further gleaning from the haiku writing, which is to reduce till you get to the kernel of what you need. So I absolutely believe that reworking and editing is extremely important. The two words that I think of my poetry, and you'll, again, kitchen, right? I get a lot of my references from the kitchen. So if you take that, gestation and marination are the two words that come to mind. So in my experience, a poem stays in gestation till the conditions are ideal for them to be born. And once born, they then are expected by the receiver, which is the poet who's lucky to receive that poem, to keep that poem in a marinated condition and continue to chisel it, redo it until the marination reaches just the right amount, right, of penetration for it to then be the final product. So that's how I see my work. as well.
You know, we don't have too much time in our poetic journey, but I want to hear 2 poems, one and then your grand finale. All right.
All right. Let's do, I'm going to try and do one, and then after that you tell me if there is still time, okay? This one is a little long, but I do want to go there.
Yes, no problem.
This is from my first book, Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words. And the context of this poem is the partition between India and Pakistan in 1947, when the British were ruling, and the subcontinent was divided into 2 dominions, displaced nearly 15 million people. It probably is the largest displacement that has occurred in history, and it led to the end, the survival of families, intergenerational trauma, et cetera, right? That the country needed, quote unquote, needed partition is another one of those myths of colonization, but we'll reserve that discussion for a different day and time. I'll jump into the poem. This poem is called Mangroves, and it's about, my father was maybe between 4 to 6 years old when the partition occurred, and his family, his parents, his father, his sisters had to move to India from Pakistan. This is about him going back to his home in Pakistan after many, many years. The poem is called Mangroves. Act 1. I set out once looking for mangroves with haunted stories about the withered woman with feet that turned inwards, the mangroves with secret spells hovering over lampposts, the mangroves where boys coupled and men gathered to grope for survival, the mangroves that displace the rotten smell of burning flesh as each canopy collapsed into an Asian pile. Act 2. I waited. I waited to enter the looming arch of the house that echoed my mother's desires in entombed gold and treasures, the house that watched silent, the gates that creaked, each howling ground, recollecting a plea, wretchedness of bruised bodies and naked shadows still lingering behind its walls. Act 3. I walked. I walked the platform again, chugging wheels that recited memories of trains moving like ghosts between places, transporting phantoms. The platform I walked again covered me in suit of butchered history. I lifted some soil, some scars, some sketches. I opened the tall gates and entered against my will into the portico to my beginnings. I swaddled myself with the elegance of my mother, the industriousness of my father, the grit of my brothers, the sacrifice of my sisters, the flawlessness of their songs as they chanted, possessed to their dead, and their crippled, and their humiliated, and their young, and newborn, and unborn. Act 5. I bow in thankfulness and accept the warm tea served by the house lady on the veranda. Mangroves. Thank you.
Wow. Exquisite. Exquisite. Please share.
That's another one that takes a little to breathe.
It does. It does. Especially the way that you share it. You truly live your poems. And I believe that is so important. If you've written it, live it. And that's what you do. That's what you do. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to read and end with, since I referred to haiku, I will read a series from Woman by the Door. And these are, I wouldn't again dare to call them haiku, but they are haiku-inspired set of poems or a garland of poems, and they're called normal. The context is these are written during the pandemic, and the rest should come together as I read. Normal. Rare blue moon, another ambulance, and blue light. So every poem is a 3-line poem, and the way you read it is you repeat it. So I'll do the same, Michael. Rare blue moon, another ambulance, and blue lights. Obituaries, age, color, caste, no bar. Obituaries, age, color, caste, no bar. Tourist season, an empty colosseum of silent coffins. Tourist season, an empty colosseum of silent coffins. War zones, a worldwide bunker of chaos. War zones, a worldwide bunker of chaos. Shallow breaths, grandma whispers, a final blessing. Shallow breaths, grandma whispers, a final blessing. Cancelled flights, the godwit migrates again this year. Cancelled flights, the godwit migrates again this year. Ocean waves, the dip and rise of economics. Ocean waves, the dip and rise of economics. Thank you, and it's called Normal, about a situation that was anything but normal.
Oh, Kashiana, does knowing that your poems are published and out there in the world validate your being a poet, or are you content knowing they're out of your system?
Michael, you broke off a little. Could you please repeat that last question?
Yes. Does knowing that your poems are published and out there in the world validate your being a poet, or are you content knowing they're out of your system?
I am never content that they're out of my system. No, like I said, I am never content that they're out of my system, and it's not uncommon for me to rewrite and revisit a poem that's been published.
All right. Well, I'd like to share a poem with you.
Thank you. I would love to.
Well, it's one that you know. It's my first time reading it. It's Joy Harjo's poem, Perhaps the World Ends Here.
Oh, I love you. Thank you.
Here we go. See, can I do this? The Michael Anthony Ingram way. Here we go. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it's been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip. We call enemies and ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. The table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. Wow. That is a beautiful poem.
Oh, you read it beautifully. Thank you. I am both laughing and crying. Thank you.
Well, you treated me all night with poetry, so I said, let me find that poem. If I do nothing else.
You made my day and week and month. I love it, and you read it so beautifully, as you always do. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you. I don't want it to end, but Things have to end.
Some things need to
What
be
I want to know.
We call it a pause, not an end. We'll talk again.
Okay, that's true. Okay, here's a couple of things I want to ask you. What piece of advice would you give to your readers?
Oh, well, I am nobody to be giving advice, but I would give the advice of if you are either a reader of poetry or a writer of poetry, come to it with a sense of prayer.
All right. Right. A sense of prayer.
That's what I would say.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Where can listeners find your work?
My website is kashianasingh.com, and you'll find links to the TEDx talk, to all my books, and a lot of the published work there as well. Michael, and I think you posted that in
Yes, I did.
In the places you've spoken about this program.
Yes. And I want to share this with you, too. Your book called Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words, my first book was titled Shelling Beans. So, yeah.
There is a connection there. Oh, wow.
It is. All right.
Wow.
What's next for you, Kashiana? Where do you go from here with your work? Where do you go from here?
A couple of places that I'm trying. I mentioned that this is the first place I'm saying this out loud, so you get to get the first preview of it. I'm a mother of a 1-year-old grandson. My manuscript in progress is called Witching Hour, and it's a poem about the life cycle of the first year of a child developing, but through that lens, looking at all the other aspects that I always look at, which is life, death, eternity, thresholds, and all of that, but through the lens of a 1-year-old, a 1-month-old, 2 months, 3 months. So that's the manuscript in progress.
Kashiana Singh, I want to thank you so much. This has been an amazing hour.
Thank you, Michael.
Took me on a journey.
Likewise.
I thought I was going to take you on a journey, but you took me on one. And
thank you so much for Not many people do that.
I want to thank you so much. You're welcome back here anytime. Anytime you say, Michael, I've got something I want to share. Can I come on? You have an open invitation.
Thank you, Michael.
Right.
Thank you for the friendship. Thank you for the warmth and the care. And I'm extremely grateful that we had this together.
Yes, all right then. Well, everyone, we are at the conclusion of another program. I want to thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the beautiful words of Kashiana Singh. Her book, Woman by the Door, is available now. Purchase it. It's incredible. I've got my copy. So again, as I share every week, let poetry ring somewhere throughout the land. Good night, everybody. Good night, Kashiana.
Good night.
Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio, is available on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. You can also check out the website at QLPOR.com.